We're in this series called Untold Stories of the Old Testament. Nehemiah might be a slightly less untold story because when I shared with my family this week that I was preaching on Nehemiah, they said, "You do know that Pastor Carl Ziegler did a 13-week series on Nehemiah when he was here as pastor." I didn't. Good for him. Do any of you remember a 13-week series on Nehemiah? That's what I told them. I said, that's over a decade ago. If you think people remember that, I can't even remember what I preached on Monday afternoon. Nehemiah is not a story that we talk about a whole lot, and so I was impressed to hear that Goodrich has heard a 13-week series on Nehemiah before, because Nehemiah is certainly one of the untold stories of the Old Testament. Because, again, Nehemiah is a rebuilder. We love the stories of the founding people of things, right? When a new church is started, the founding pastor is this person that's held up, and it can be hard sometimes when the founding pastor finally does move on for a new pastor to take their place. We love in America our idea of the founding fathers of our country. And as I mentioned, Abraham, Moses, and David, these are names that we know because they were the founding leaders of what became Israel. But rebuilding can be just as important sometimes, even if it is more forgotten by history. When the Reverend Joe Daniels arrived as the pastor of Emory Fellowship United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C., it was a congregation that was in decline, and their historic church was falling apart. I mean, they did have a historic building, and for good reason, this church is viewed as historic and is on the Historic Registry of Landmarks. It's in the Brightwood neighborhood of Washington, D.C., which has a long history dating back to 1832 when it was just a small part of Washington, D.C., but it quickly grew. It was an important area during the Civil War, and in fact, the original church that was there in the 1830s was claimed by the Union Army because it sat up on a hill and it became part of a fort that was used during the Civil War. This location, this fort, was one of the only places where a sitting president has taken fire during a war, because Abraham Lincoln was there in the midst of a battle and shots were fired. So this is a big deal historically, because usually our presidents are not in the line of fire during wars. But by the time 1998 rolled around, the church was in disrepair. It had swelled in the 1900s to have a huge membership and had slowly declined in the late 90s, or into the late 90s. But Joe Daniels came as a new pastor there, and he helped them to rebuild. And why do I talk about Joe Daniels in a church in Washington, D.C.? Well, he did it because he focused on Nehemiah. He wrote a book, in fact, called Walking with Nehemiah, and he uses the whole story of Nehemiah to help us to realize that if we want to thrive as churches, then we need to learn from the rebuilding that Nehemiah does in the book of Nehemiah. He uses the entire story of Nehemiah, goes chapter by chapter, and talks about the ways in which we can still learn from Nehemiah how to rebuild our communities of faith as well. And he's done that with this church. They went out into the community and made connections and made relationships. And Joe Daniels says what he stopped worrying about was what the church thought the community needed and started asking, what does the community actually need? And again, what people said to them in that part of Washington, D.C. is, we need affordable housing. And so what they have done, what they ended up breaking ground on in 2015, sometimes rebuilding takes a long time, right? He arrived in 1998. 2015, they finally built a 99-unit affordable housing complex. And what they literally did was built it in a U shape around the church building that sat there in the center. Because they said, we asked what the community needed, and they said they needed affordable housing. And so if the church wants to thrive, it needs to do what's good for the community. And so they built affordable housing. Nehemiah also does what is good for the community. And you have to understand some of the history here, because of course, if you hear Nehemiah out of context, all you heard Zeke and Zoe read was a lot of names that you maybe don't understand and you have no idea what is going on. Nehemiah takes place after the people of Israel have been sent into exile. This happens, again, I mentioned David at the beginning, right? He was this great king. His son Solomon follows him as king. And there's a period of time when Israel really thrives. But there's an empire growing at that same time. And we know it if you've studied history. It's the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians eventually come and conquer this tiny little nation of Israel in the Middle East. And the way that they effectively destroy them, it's been tradition throughout history, the way you do it is to send people away from their homelands and make them disperse into the other people. That's a way to sort of destroy their identity. That's what's done to the people of Israel. They're sent into exile throughout the Babylonian Empire. Eventually, the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and there's a Persian empire, but the Persians seem to like or have a different way of dealing with the Israelites, and so they're allowed to return to Jerusalem, and that's when Nehemiah takes place. Some of the Israelites who had been sent away from their homeland by the Babylonians are allowed by the Persians to return and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild their nation. This is about 50 years after they've first been sent away. And Nehemiah does this rebuilding of Jerusalem, and he does it because it's what the community needs. They need these things to feel safe. They need these things to reclaim their identity. And so the part that we read today is specifically about the building of the wall around Jerusalem. There had been historically a wall. Just as a side note, I think this is funny. The story today that we read says that they built the wall and they managed to do it in 52 days, which is really quite an impressive feat. You can't seem to get contractors to build anything in 52 days these days. We've excavated Jerusalem and the historical pieces that are there, and we found a wall, and the people that have excavated have identified that this is most likely the wall that was built by Nehemiah, the second wall around Jerusalem. And believe it or not, it's not a very well-built wall. That may be why they finished it in 52 days. It stood, it kept people out, but when they did further digging and found the original wall, it was a much more well-constructed wall. So that's just one of my tangents, but I just think that's funny. Nehemiah does all this because it's good for the community. And Pastor Joe Daniels, says that he thinks we've lost our passion in the church these days for doing what's good for the community. He says we've come to exist for ourselves when we need to exist for the world around us. I hear lots of church people complain about the fact that the church is no longer the center of communal life. People will say, church is where you used to go on Sundays and Wednesdays, and whenever people needed something, they would go to the church. But I don't very often hear ourselves stopping to ask how it is that we might be the center of the community again. We instead seem to complain that we're no longer the center of community, assuming that somehow we should be and that other people need to figure out how to make us the center of the community again, rather than us asking ourselves how we might become the center of the community again. Joe Daniels did that by going out and asking what the community needed and building it. And again, I love that they put the housing around the church so that the church was at the center, but they also provided what the community needed. We can't keep doing the same things that we always have. We have to reach out and reconnect to the depth of our faith and let it lead us forward to new relationships and new opportunities, and asking the question, what is it that the community needs? It's what Nehemiah does. Jerusalem wasn't built back up just as it was before, but he is part of reforming the people of Israel and building Jerusalem up again for the people in ways that are needed. So I told you that Joe Daniels uses the whole story of Nehemiah. We did not want to read all of the chapters of Nehemiah today, although I know that when I read these long scripture passages, you sometimes think we are. But we have one part of the story today, and what is it that we learn from today's story? Well, you heard that there's this group of people, Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, who keep sending messages to Nehemiah, meet with us. And Nehemiah keeps saying, no, I'm not going to meet with you. And we are told throughout the story why, which is that Nehemiah believes that they intend harm to him. And that's most likely true. They seem to be frustrated that the Jews are rebuilding Jerusalem, even though they have the permission of the king of Persia to do so. They threaten, and they do it very subtly. They keep inviting Nehemiah to come, just come meet with us. But Nehemiah keeps saying no, because he believes that they're calling him off to a far-off part of Israel, into a corner of Israel, basically. And he sees it for what it is, that they are seeking to harm him. Because without a good leader, they figure they can stop the rebuilding of Jerusalem. They try it in a multitude of tactics. We're told that 4 times they invite him to come. A 5th time they decide to end up using some of the local religious authorities to say to Nehemiah, you should go and come. And he sees through that as well. They keep trying and trying and trying, and Nehemiah sees through it all. So what we learn from this part of the story today is that there will be opposition to us when we do what God wants us to do, but we can't let that stop us. There's always been opposition when people try to do things. One of the stories that I read in the last 5 years or so was about how Edison and Tesla fought as they designed electrical systems in our country. A real quick, if you haven't ever read this story, a real quick primer. Edison designed the direct current system of electricity, and Tesla devised the alternating current, so DC and AC. AC/DC. Some of you listened to that band at some point, right? And they fought over this, and they fought over whose should be the system that the whole country would adopt. It turns out that Tesla's system was actually better. In case you don't know, when you plug your plug into the wall outlet today, you're getting alternating current coming through your plug. Direct current tends to be the stuff that is in batteries. Direct current is better for a few things. One, that it can be stored better than alternating current. And 2, that it is less lethal to people is generally what they say. Again, another side note. Edison, even though he's trying to convince everyone to move to direct current, right, sells a machine to prisons to kill people that runs on alternating current. This is part of the argument that direct current is a little bit safer when you come into contact with it. So batteries are the things we have that are direct current these days, but alternating current is better for certain things. One, that it travels better, and this is why we have it all over our country. DC current loses power as it travels, and so it isn't useful for a countrywide system of electricity. Alternating current, however, doesn't have that issue. And that's the main reason that we use alternating current in our homes these days, because it travels so much better. And the lethalness of it is also a bit of a sham, just so you know. It's It was the claim that Edison made because as Tesla was trying to build his alternating current system, some of the workers died because the other thing about alternating current is it can use much higher capacities than direct current. And so it can be more dangerous at those high capacities, right? And so some workers had died. It turns out that electricity, just in case you don't know, is lethal no matter what, right? It's not a very fair claim to say alternating current is more dangerous than direct current. They both can be lethal. But they fought and fought and fought. What's interesting is that we know more about Edison, even though he's the one that ultimately lost, because Tesla, just wasn't as good at fighting the battles. He ended up selling off his patent and all these things that ended up resulting in him dying at the end of his life basically penniless, even though he had constructed and conceived of the system that our entire electrical system now runs on in our country. We all remember Edison because he was a much better fighter in some ways, right? But regardless, there is always opposition, and in this case, it's just the opposition of two people, right, fighting about which one's better, direct current or alternating current. And they literally threatened one another, especially Edison. Again, I told you that he was a better fighter. He threatened Tesla with lawsuits and all kinds of things like that. People will threaten us, and they will lie to try to stop us from doing what we're doing, and this is what Nehemiah experiences. At one point, the religious authorities say there are people that want to kill you, which is somewhat true, but they are telling it to him as a lie in order to get him into the temple where they can kill him. People will lie and threaten and try to stop us. And sometimes that opposition comes most strongly from ourselves. And so you heard Patty talk today about fear. And I really think that this is part of the biggest opposition we face, which is our own selves. We want to do the right thing, but for whatever reason, we stop because we're afraid of whatever it is. Fear of failure, fear of being embarrassed, fear of not getting it right. And so we just never do the thing that God is calling us to do because we are too afraid to do it. And this is where Nehemiah is most helpful to us today, because he has all these people threatening him. He has all these opportunities to be afraid. And what he says is, specifically when he's told, you should come to the temple because people want to kill you, he says, who am I that I should run away? And I think this is a message for us, friends, because fear keeps us from trying to be who God truly wants us to be. But we are people who are meant to say, who are we to run away? We have to instead stay true to who we are. And part of being true to who we are is figuring out who we actually are. And I think we sometimes have lost sight of that. And this is also what Joe Daniels was talking about. We've become more concerned with our own wants and desires and needs within the church rather than seeking to connect to the community. We have lost a sense of who God called us to be and who we truly are meant to be. We know this because we also, we take lots of polls. And an interesting poll that was taken about 15 years ago found that 82% of Americans, when asked if the phrase, God helps those who help themselves, was in the Bible, 82% of Americans said, yes, it is. Now, that may not be a big deal because, not all that many people read the Bible, right? So they then asked that question to people who specifically said they do read the Bible and identify as Christians. And we did better, thank God. It was only 81% of Christians who said, yes, that is in the Bible. We can't live fully into God, who God has called us to be, if we don't even know who we are. And part of knowing who we are is understanding the scriptures that inform who we are. And this, again, is part of the work in another part of Nehemiah that he does. He reconnects the people back to Scripture. We need to know Scripture because that's also where our courage comes from. And Patty practically wrote my sermon for me because she pointed this out, that Scripture continually reminds us not to be afraid. Scripture repeatedly reminds us that it's not about us, but it's about doing what God would have us do. And that it's not about us, it's about the community around us and seeking to put others first. Nehemiah, that name, means something like Yahweh has given comfort. And I love that because Nehemiah is able to do what he does, not because of who he is, but because of what God has done for him. And God has given him comfort in the midst of all these threats that surround him. And in fact, the passage ended today with this. It said, they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. That's what Nehemiah does. He says at the end of this story, all of this is happening because of God. And Reverend Joe Daniels does the same thing anytime he's interviewed about all that has happened to grow this community that was near death. He constantly points out that it's about what God is doing in Brightwood. It has very little to do with him. If we want to matter to the community, then we need to do the work of reconnecting to who we are called to be, letting go of our fear and truly wanting not what we want, but what the world is needing. And we will face opposition at times. But Daniel says that we have to be like Nehemiah and not let that stop us because we love the community so much that it can't stop us. This is what he ends up saying. He says, you connect to loving the community so much that even when there are threats, even when there is fear, you don't let it stop you because the love for the community is greater than that fear and you can't be stopped. And I think that may be our biggest problem. We have stopped loving the community around us, and instead we look out at the world with judgment. We see people who are living sinfully, and we say they need Jesus, but we don't ever reflect back and realize that this is true of all of us. And so it's not a helpful way to look at other people. We're neglecting to look at ourselves in the same way, and instead we're not doing what we should be doing, which is seeking to do good for people. And so I do think that Nehemiah should be read more often. It shouldn't be one of the untold stories of the Old Testament. We need to become like Nehemiah, loving our community, being deeply committed to doing what God has called us to do in our community, even when there is opposition, so that we might rebuild. We can't keep looking around and being the Eeyores of the world. Oh, bother, the church just isn't what it used to be. What are we going to do? We know what we need to do. The church thrives because it responds to the world around it and seeks to love it. We have to be in love with rebuilding the same way Nehemiah loves being allowed to come back and rebuild the community that he's a part of in Jerusalem. Amen.